I'm Hannah Donnert with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Che enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnerships, calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che Partnership webinar titled Intersectionality and Environmental Justice. Our moderator today is Karen Wang, Director of Che and founder of Because Health. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in your questions to the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your web window at any point during the presentation. After the presentation, our moderator will read out questions for our speakers to respond to. We'll get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our speakers and our moderator. The webinar is scheduled to last for 70 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll pass things off to you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to give an introduction to our speakers. First, we would like to welcome back to Che Dr. Amy Zota, who is an associate professor at the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the George Washington University Milken Institute School of Public Health. She directs the ARISE EJ Lab at George Washington, whose mission is to secure environmental justice and improve health equity through advancements in science, policy, clinical practice, and communication. Dr. Zota also recently launched the Agents of Change in Environmental Health initiative with Environmental Health News to amplify voices of future environmental health and justice leaders from underrepresented groups. We are big fans, so please check out their podcasts and blog posts at agentsofchangein.eh.com. Our second speaker today is Dr. Camila Alvarez, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced. Dr. Alvarez received her PhD and MA in sociology from the University of Oregon and her BAs in sociology and mathematics from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She specializes in air pollution, social inequalities, environmental justice, and quantitative methodology. Her research focuses on how environmental problems manifest as a result of social and systemic inequalities. Dr. Rebecca Mandel is our third speaker today. She is a qualitative and mixed methods researcher at Arbor Research Collaborative for Health. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, where she researched how advocates are mobilizing to protect vulnerable communities from toxic exposures harmful to reproductive health. She was a fellow at the Graham Sustainability Institute and in the REACH, the Decision Makers Training Fellowship through the University of California, San Francisco program on reproductive health and environment. We are very pleased to have these three speakers to speak to us today about intersectionality and environmental justice. So with that, Dr. Zota, I'll have you take it away. You are on mute, Dr. Zota.
Can you hear me now? Everything okay?
Yes, now we can hear you.
So thank you, Karen and Hannah, for organizing this very exciting webinar at the cutting edge of environmental health and justice, and for welcoming me back. So today I'm going to speak to you about integrating intersectionality into the exposome and applications for theory, data, and practice. The work I'm going to speak to you about is really an abbreviated version of a recent commentary that I co-wrote with Brianna Van Noy, an early career researcher in my lab, and that was just published in January of this year in American Journal of Public Health. It is open access, so if you're interested in the ideas that I present, I encourage you to read the full commentary. And this work was really motivated by one guiding question, and that is, how can environmental health sciences become more effective in advancing health equity and environmental justice? Because I really do think our field is falling short in achieving those goals. And while I know those of us in the academic space always think a lot about data, what data we're collecting, how we analyze it, I really argue that we have to take a broader view and we need to rethink the theories that go into our studies, the actual data we collect, how we collect it, how we analyze it, and also importantly, how we move that data into action. So that's going to be kind of the guiding frame on the kind of novel ideas, the novel framework that I am going to talk about. So just to kind of start us off, before we can talk about integrating intersectionality into the exposome, I always like to kind of define these frameworks so that we're all on the same page. The exposome is a leading framework in the environmental health science field. It's been supported quite a bit by NIEHS, both in terms of infrastructure as well as data analytic capacity. Loosely, it's a contextual model of disease that really takes a life course approach to consider the totality of an individual's environmental exposures. And they kind of bin these exposures into several different buckets. And they kind of, the framework makes a big difference between external measures of exposure, which are chemical and physical hazards in food, consumer products, water, air, soil, and the built environment, as well as internal measures of exposure. So these are often those markers that are measured on omics technologies like the epigenome, proteome, metabolome. And this paradigm differs from traditional epidemiologic methods in three ways. So expanded and dynamic exposure assessment, integration of exposure and response over time and space, and use of high dimensional big data for data-driven discovery of unexpected exposure disease associations. Intersectionality, which may be new to some people in the audience, is a critical theoretical framework and really comes out of kind of Black feminist scholarship. So Kimberly Crenshaw was really the one who coined this term to address the synergistic experiences of Black women who endure multiple forms of oppression as both Black and female. So it's really a theoretical framework for understanding how multiple social identities, such as race, gender, socioeconomic status, intersect at the micro level of individual experience to reflect interlocking systems of privilege and oppression. So here, racism, sexism at the macro social structural level. Some key kind of tenets of this framework is that social identities are not independent and unidimensional, but multiple and intersecting. And, people from multiple historically oppressed and marginalized groups should be the focal or starting point. I should say my own journey with intersectionality has been informed quite extensively by Dr. Lisa Bolag, who herself is a Black female scholar grounded in social psychology. She's at GW. We've been collaborating for several years, and I think she saw the relevance of intersectionality to the work that I do way before I had the vocabulary to really understand it. And she recently edited this special section on intersectionality in public health in AJPH and invited my lab to contribute. And so that's kind of how the genesis of this commentary came about. So what would be the applications of this framework that, why do we need this framework that integrates intersectionality in the exposome? Well, I would argue it allows us to answer new questions, that important questions that right now we may not have the conceptual or empirical tools to address. And some of these questions include, what are upstream drivers of environmental exposures? How can we move away from framing race as a biological construct? How does intersectional discrimination become biologically embedded? How can we center experiences of people who are marginalized? Who do our studies currently neglect? And how can we move towards intersectionality informed public policy? So now I'm going to give you some examples from my ongoing work at GW. So let's start with looking at upstream drivers of environmental exposures. I study consumer product chemicals. Consumer product chemicals are a common type of exposure included in the exposome. This is from a paper published a few years ago, we see that Black women are more highly exposed to beauty product related chemicals. In this case, 2 different types of phthalates that are commonly used. And so, right, this is kind of, my group wasn't the first. This is the type of research, commonly found in environmental health. And one thing I want to point out is the typical environmental health framework really focuses on individual behaviors. So, I showed you chemical exposure burden there. There's often, an emphasis to link it both with downstream health outcomes as well as kind of individual exposure determinants. So in this case, my work and others have shown how beauty product usage contributes to chemical exposure burden, whether that's use of certain hair straightening products or fragranced feminine care products. These have been, we know that these contain endocrine disrupting chemicals like phthalates and parabens and have been associated with increased levels in the body. But what, this is often missing is those upstream factors, because what we have found is that beauty product use does not occur in a vacuum. That these what men and women and children use varies a lot by one's social identity, right? So there are racialized beauty practices, and if we go further upstream, intersectional discrimination influences the types of beauty practices we each practice. So what does this really look like? So this is something we call the environmental injustice of beauty. And I developed this kind of idea with Dr. Bhavna Shamasunder, and we wrote about this a few years ago. But it's kind of recognizing that there is a hierarchy of racially coded degrees of femininity and beauty that culminate in whiteness and white femininity as the norm. And this hierarchy is informed by social and economic processes like patriarchy, colonialism, as well as systems of power and oppression like sexism, racism, classism. And all of these are codified through policies that don't allow certain type of hairstyles in the workplace, targeted advertising that make women who are outside of this beauty norm feel insecure, or even cultural norms and peer pressure that lead to internalized racism and beauty rituals. And so some of the examples we give, and I'll just focus on one for the sake of time, is around hair. So one of the racialized beauty norms is around hair textures, especially in Black women, where there is a preference for straightened or relaxed hair. And so, racism, sexism, classism intersect in Black hair discrimination, and it penalizes Black people, especially Black women, for wearing their hair in natural styles. And so some women are often feel the pressure to straighten their hair or use products that have high levels of these, these chemicals. And indeed, hair relaxer use is associated with certain adverse health outcomes like increased risk of fibroids. So that's one example of how the environmental injustice of beauty may operate. So what is the relevance of this type of thinking? Well, I would say it can help us reimagine the policy landscape. So if you think about the typical type of environmental policies that get enacted, it's really around this box that I've highlighted. So it's trying to essentially minimize toxic chemicals in beauty products. And one example of that is California's Toxic Free Cosmetic Act, which was just passed, that essentially prohibits the use of about 20 different chemicals in products sold in California. But if we start thinking about intersectional discrimination being this upstream root cause of toxic beauty product usage, then we have other levers to address. And one example of how we could address intersectional discrimination and its impact on racialized beauty practices is the Crown Act. And this is a law that prohibits race-based hair discrimination in schools and the workplace. And it was first introduced and passed in California, and now 7 states have passed the Crown Act. So now I'm going to move on to another case study having to do with race, phthalates, and the fibroid epigenome. Briefly, uterine fibroids are non-cancerous tumors of the uterus that grow in response to estrogen and progesterone. They're associated with a lot of morbidity, and their fibroids are more severe and common in Black women compared to white women. So fibroids are larger, more numerous, grow more rapidly, and occur at an earlier stage in Black women compared to white women. I want to focus on the conceptualization of race in fibroid research, but note that this conceptualization of race is not unique to this one disorder or disease. This is a kind of symptomatic of a larger underlying problem. So most fibroid scientists have conceptualized race as a biological factor. And most clinicians and basic scientists, really focus on identifying molecular and genetic mechanisms responsible for racial disparities. And while there may be a few isolated studies that have found some biological differences between Black and white women, recent research suggests that genetic and molecular factors do not explain increased fibroid burden for Black women. I think it's really important here to note race is not a biological construct. Racial categories, in fact, are weak proxies for genetic diversity, and the use of biological concepts of race in biomedical, public health, and genetics research is problematic because racial groups are heterogeneous and lack clear-cut genetic boundaries. Race is a social classification of people based on phenotype. And structural racism has generally been under-examined in etiologic research, in both fibroids research and in public health and medicine more generally. Here, structural racism is a confluence of institutions, culture, history, ideology, and codified practices that generate and perpetuate inequity among racial and ethnic groups. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a transdisciplinary research that I'm the PI of, ongoing at GW, to address racial inequities in uterine fibroids. So my team includes clinical gynecology, human epigenetics, environmental chemistry, social psychology, radiology, and bioinformatics, so very multidisciplinary. And I'm now going to kind of show you some of the research that we've published from phase 1 and where we're trying to go with this in phase 2. And so our study population are premenopausal women with fibroids seeking care at the GW Medical Center. Our populations tends to be majority Black women, but with a lot of socioeconomic heterogeneity. In fact, our population is majority college educated. So that allows us to ask some unique questions. Consistent with the first national study in this population, we find that beauty-related phthalate exposures are more than 30% higher in Black women compared to non-Black women. We also found that higher urinary concentrations of high molecular weight phthalates, so those used in plastics, are associated with increased uterine volume, which is a measure of fibroid burden. So really trying to get at fibroid growth, not just looking at incidence or risk, but really kind of looking at kind of a life course perspective. Bringing back the exposome framework, we've dug into kind of the biological mechanisms around what may be driving kind of these, the environmental toxicity. And here we're focused on microRNAs, which are one form of epigenetic modifications that have previously been shown to be critical to fibroid biology. And so here we actually collected tumor tissue samples from study subjects that we also had their urinary biomarkers of. We looked at 754 microRNAs, we adjusted for multiple comparisons. And so what's interesting here is we found some associations between phthalates and microRNA associations. And we also found that some of these vary by race and ethnicity, so that the profile of these associations were different between Black and white women. And while we can't, our current study design doesn't really allow us to understand what's driving these differences, even just the way we framed these results in the discussion, I think is, it can help drive this conversation, because rather than make it about differences in biology, we really think here that race is a proxy for social experiences, and that what we're really seeing are social environmental interactions on the epigenome. And so this is, really almost more hypothesis generating. Lastly, I just want to point out this qualitative work that Brianna Van Nooy's paper, I think, actually just came out today. So we're also doing qualitative work to really understand psychosocial and social structural processes. And even in this first pilot paper, we did find, that these upstream social and historical factors does inform Black women's experiences with their fibroids. And I just want to read this quote. While some respondents expressed positive or neutral feelings about hysterectomy or the removal of their uterus as a treatment option, others reacted negatively to the recommendation, conveying medical mistrust. So all of this is alive for this population, as they engage in kind of the medical experience around their disorder. So how are we moving this work forward? So that was kind of, you could see in phase 1, we're doing all this different types of work. And in phase 2 now, we're really trying to kind of bring it together and build on these ideas in an intersectionality framework. We're starting to integrate sexual and gender minorities. In our case, we started recruiting trans men without fibroids, having hysterectomies as part of their gender transition. We're going further into the epigenetics, identifying novel epigenetic signaling pathways in fibroids. So we're actually starting to characterize epigenetic profiles in extracellular vesicles, so which we can measure in blood, so we can move away from tissue samples. And lastly, we're actually trying to move into intentionally characterizing impacts of gendered racism using a mixed methods approach. So both doing qualitative focus groups as well as integrating validated structural survey skills like gendered racism, racial microaggression scale, which captures experiences of racism and sexism simultaneously. So in conclusion, why do we need this new framework? It gives us this greater ability to examine the interplay between social and historical processes and systems of power and oppression that shape environmental health risk. It also gives us greater attention to causal processes producing environmental health inequities. And I think it will lead to development of more effective interventions and public policy that address systemic change. And just want to make a plug about agents of change, because this is how we're moving intersectionality into practice by lifting up the voices of scientists and scholars who are from multiply marginalized backgrounds. And in fact, we worked with Che last year to do 2 webinars with a series of webinars with our fellows. And it was during one of those webinars that this conversation of intersectionality came up, because for many of them, their version of environmental health, the environmental health that resonates with them, is inherently intersectional. And from those conversations came this idea of really doing a webinar explicitly on intersectionality and environmental justice. So you can check us out on social media or at our website. So with that, I'll just thank my team, my co-investigators, and my funding sources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zota, for joining us again and sharing all of your pioneering research. This is really important work. And we're going to wait for now Dr. Camila Alvarez to pull up her slides, and she's just right there. And I want to remind everyone to feel free to put your questions in the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. Are you all set, Camila?
Yes.
Great.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zota, for that presentation. It's really inspiring me and getting my getting me thinking. So let me get situated here. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here to present some of the work that I've been doing for the last couple years. And before I get started, I do want to give a huge acknowledgement to my collaborator on this project, Claire Evans, an assistant professor at the University of Oregon. So thank you, Claire. So where I want to start this presentation is, Dr. Zota gave a really comprehensive and interesting talk about like medical and sociology of health and sort of a lot about like the individual. My presentation is going to like zoom out a little bit more and be talking about neighborhoods and communities and environmental justice issues and intersectionality with that. And where I want to start is that, communities and scholars have drawn attention to serious case studies of environmental health inequalities in communities of color and poor neighborhoods. Some of the cases that come up is Cancer Alley in the state of Louisiana. It's an industrial corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And there are some areas in this industrial corridor that report 50 times greater cancer risk than the national average. Another case study that comes in mind with this environmental health inequalities is also the San Joaquin Valley, which is where I am located at the University of California, Merced. And the San Joaquin Valley has the highest asthma rates in the state of California. So when I'm like looking at these various exceptional case studies of injustices that are happening across the country, a question that begins to emerge for me is whether these are exceptions or outliers, or whether there is a pattern occurring among these cases, and how can we better understand what is going on with social theories. So there are three sort of frameworks that come to mind when this question occurs for me. The first one is intersectionality. Intersectionality comes from Black feminist thought, including legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw and sociologist Patricia Hill Collins. And intersectionality, as Dr. Zota had mentioned in her presentation, really draws attention to those interlocking and overlapping systems of privilege and oppression, including racism, sexism, and socioeconomic inequality. And, intersectionality can happen at like the individual level, but it can also happen like at multiple levels, at like the structural and macro and the community level. So it's very multi-scalar framework for understanding inequalities. And in particular with this project, I draw upon Leslie McCall's. She has three different approaches that she explains you can understand intersectionality with, which is the anti-categorical, the intra-categorical, and the intercategorical. And I use the intercategorical, which usually looks at statistical and quantitative analyses. And in particular, it uses analytical categories to examine inequality among various overlapping intersectional points. The second research that I draw upon is environmental justice work. Environmental justice and inequality research focuses on the unequal distribution of environmental bads and environmental goods. And case studies and national levels analyses have shown that environmental health risk exposure is higher for communities of color and low-income neighborhoods. And also what's really important about EJ work is not just understanding like the uneven distribution, but also understanding how do social systems of oppression relate to those disproportionate exposures of pollutants. And then finally, the last work that I draw upon in this research is the social determinants of health, which draws attention to how social inequalities and institutions affect individuals' health. And one in particular that comes in mind is eco-social theory, which is really about understanding how do like social processes and social institutions outside the individual really get embodied within us, right? And come out in very much real consequences like our health. So with those three subfields in mind, one research question comes to mind for me, which is, are there interaction effects or overlapping neighborhood demographics for environmental health risks across census tracts in the United States? And so here I am assessing whether there is an intersectional patterning happening across racialized, gendered, and class systems for environmental health risk in regards to air toxins. So the unit that I look at is the community and the neighborhood level. And the proxy that I use to look at that is the census tract. The reason why I use the census tract is it's pretty commonly used among researchers, and there's also a lot of data that is available at that unit of analysis. This is a picture of where I live in Merced County. These are various census tracts that are within Merced County in California. And there are over 72,000 census tracts in the United States. In this study, we did look at 72,103 across the continental and include Alaska and Hawaii as well. And then so the data that I used for this analyses is, the first one I want to talk about is the dependent variable, which is the variable that we're interested in explaining. And so that variable is annual estimated cancer risk from air toxins for the year 2014. This is the latest data that has been published by the Environmental Protection Agency's National Air Toxins Emission Assessment, which is also referred to as NATA. NATA, the way they go about to estimate this data is by collecting emission sources and also running air quality and meteorological modeling data and applying that data to daily outdoor activity models. So this estimated cancer risk from air toxins is for outdoor exposure, because there's a lot of exposure that also happens indoor, but we don't. This data does not include that. And then we use a number of other independent variables that we're interested in connecting to the dependent variable. But the ones that I want to talk about specifically here is the ones that come from the US Census American Community Survey. And then also we use the USDA's rural and urban continuum codes to figure out which areas are considered metropolitan or not. All right, so now that we have a better understanding of the data, the research questions, sort of the theoretical situation of all of this, how do we go about to analyze all of this? So the analytical strategy here is something novel that we're developing here, and it's also building off of what previous research has looked at. So traditionally in statistics, you have like a lot of data, right? And you want to understand the dependent variable. So what you have to go about doing is figuring out how much of the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable is driven by the actual pattern itself and not driven by like random chance. So and as a lot of social statistics has an issue, is that a lot of individuals are dependent on each other, either spatially or through groups. So one way you can go about to control that correlation among either individuals or areas is to do a multi-level model, which controls for the variation by grouping individuals within groups. And traditionally, the spatial multi-level approach is that you would take like our unit of analysis, which is census tracts, and nest it within census counties, so the bigger unit, and then nest the counties within the states. And so that's how it's traditionally done. There has been some unique innovations being developed in the sociology of health. One in particular I want to talk about is intersectional MIDA. And so this approach looks at the unit of analysis as individuals, and it nests individuals within intersectional social strata. And what this intersectional social strata is it's all the various combinations of race, class, gender, immigration status, and nesting people within those groups instead of geographic groups, because these groups are theoretically informed, while these groups are more like administratively informed. And so that way we can sort of partition and understand and use the multi-level model approach to understand intersectionality instead of like geography. And so the approach that we developed within this paper is a mixture between these two models. And so remember, we use census tracts and not individuals. So we nest census tracts within intersectional strata of tracts based on neighborhood level demographics. And so the way you actually go about doing that is you create a number of strata ideas, and each digit within the strata ID represents like a category, because this goes back to the intercategorical approach of adopting analytical categories in order to examine inequalities. And so the 5 categories that we look at is racial and ethnic composition, which is made up of the percent of Black and Latinx residents. The second one is the percent of female-headed household. The third one is percent of some college education or more. And then we have medium household income and urbanicity, which is whether the tract is residing in a metropolitan. And so totally we have 216 categories. We use terse tiles. That's I could talk more about that if somebody has another question in the Q&A. I could go more into that. And so an example of this strata ID would be that 23331 is high percent Black residents, low percent Latinx residents, high percent female-headed household, high percent some education or more, high percent medium household income, and is in a metro. And this is sort of like a cheat sheet for the categories to quickly find out what do those digits mean. And so using our analytical approach with the data, this is a caterpillar plot. It plots the predicted values of estimated cancer risk from air toxins based on the stratum. And as you can see, there is significant variation among them, but they're also patterned, right? And what we found here is that about 18% of the variation of estimated cancer risk is explained by the higher levels, which here is the intersectional social strata of the tracts. And then we went about to control the additive effects to see how much of that, like, if it's still robust, like is the effect still there if you like add those control variables. And what we found is that approximately 15% of the between stratum variation can still be attributed to interaction effects. And so here is a zoom in of the previous one, because the other one didn't have like each one. It would be very difficult to have that. So here I have the actual stratum IDs. So here we can see that the stratum IDs with the highest exposure to estimated cancer risk from air toxins is high percent Black, high percent Latinx residents, high percent female-headed households, low percent of educational attainment, low medium household income, and residing in urban areas. Whereas compared to the stratum with the lowest exposure to air toxins is low percent Black residents, low percent Latinx residents, low percent female-headed household, higher educational attainment, higher median household income, and residing in non-metro areas. And comparing the highest to the lowest, we find that the highest stratum reports 2.6 times greater estimated cancer risk from air toxins as compared to the lowest. And these results are robust to outliers. We did some what would you call them, like statistical checks, like removing the outliers and things like that, and you still find the same results as before. So in conclusion, what we find here is that across the tracts in the United States, we do find significant intersectional inequalities in environmental health from air toxins, and our findings also support the need to apply an intercategorical intersectional approach to understand environmental disparities. And also we do find stark polarity between environmental health risk. And so in conclusion with that, I'll just say, you know, air pollution is a major EJ and public health issue, but it is also important to understand that those disparities are not based on like singular or case studies, but rather multiple overlapping systems of oppression. And so I'll end my presentation there, and I look forward to Dr. Mandel's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alvarez. While we're waiting for Dr. Mandel to pull up her slides, I just want to remind everyone, feel free to put in your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them after our panel discussion. And it looks like Dr. Mandel is almost set there. Beautiful. We can see your slides now.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Camilla, thank you for that very engaging presentation. Thank you for having me at this webinar. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. Before I start, I'd just like to make clear that I'm not presenting on behalf of my current organization, Arbor Research Collaborative for Health. Instead, I'm going to present a paper that I published based upon dissertation research that I did at the University of Michigan. And my co-authors on this paper are Professors Barbara Israel and Amy Schultz. So first, I'm going to talk about the link between toxic exposures and reproductive health and the role of social movements in translating research in this area into policy. And then I'll talk about my research objectives and methods, followed by one of the main findings that emerged from this research, which is that intersectionality is a collective action frame being used by advocates addressing toxics and reproductive health. And I'll describe how they're using this frame to break free from identity-based, issue-based, and movement-based silos. And finally, I'll talk about the implications of this research and some recommendations. So toxicants in air, water, land, and consumer products are linked to adverse reproductive health outcomes, such as compromised fetal and infant development and infertility. And communities of color, indigenous, and low-income communities often have both higher exposure to toxicants and greater susceptibility to them because of social and place-based stressors such as discrimination, poverty, and poor food access that can make it harder for the body to cope with toxic exposures. And all of these factors can contribute to reproductive health inequities. More protective policies, particularly in vulnerable communities, are critical because individuals have a limited ability to avoid environmental exposures. However, getting better policies passed is a challenge. This is where social movements can come in by advocating for policy change. The environmental justice movement, which I'll refer to as the EJ movement, and the reproductive justice movement, which I'll refer to as the RJ movement, are well poised in particular to address these issues. The EJ movement addresses disproportionate environmental harm in communities of color, indigenous, and low-income communities. And the RJ movement expands the dialogue about reproductive health and rights to consider structural influences and environmental conditions that shape the reproductive lives of women of color, indigenous women, and women of low socioeconomic status. And these movements therefore share an interest in a healthy environment. So my research sought to identify collective action frames of advocates working at the intersection of the EJ and RJ movements. Developing collective action frames involves 3 core tasks: diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational framing, or in other words, how advocates collectively identify problems, conceptualize solutions, and motivate action around a common cause. In 2014 and 2015, I conducted 36 qualitative, semi-structured interviews with advocates who work at the EJ-RJ intersection, as well as 4 interviews with funders who fund work at this intersection. I used a constructivist, grounded theory approach, hallmarks of which are to develop theory from data, to engage in an iterative process in which data collection and analysis take place concurrently so as to inform each other, and to discover key concepts throughout the research process, rather than relying upon concepts identified beforehand. And the reason I mention this last point is because I want to stress that I did not approach this research thinking about intersectionality. It's something that I identified in the interviews. The interviews took place in person and via phone and video chat with participants in 23 different cities across the US. I initially identified them through professional contacts and via internet search, and then I used a snowball sample whereby participants referred me to other potential participants. And after each interview, I administered a demographic survey and gave participants the option of being included in an organizational resource list to facilitate networking. Additionally, I examined over 65 documents to see how advocacy organizations message to stakeholders about toxics and reproductive health. And I also did member checking, where I shared preliminary findings with participants for feedback. And then after the study was over, I shared the final analysis with participants via a written synopsis and webinar. So a key study finding was that intersectionality is being used as a collective action frame, meaning that many advocates who I interviewed are approaching the connection between toxics and reproductive health using intersectionality as a core analytic and organizing principle. According to intersectionality theory, inequities do not result from single distinct factors. Rather, they arise from intersections between different social locations, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and class, power relations, and experiences. These experiences are shaped by interrelated structural systems of privilege and oppression, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism. In the study sample, this framework was particularly prevalent among advocates who identified strongly with the reproductive justice movement, reflecting its centrality to that movement. So now I'm going to talk about the 3 ways in which advocates are using an intersectional framework when engaging in advocacy around toxics and reproductive health. And as you'll see, I'm going to highlight the voices of interview participants throughout this talk by providing many of my findings via direct quotes. Also, please note that many participants gave their consent to reveal their identity. I'll first talk about breaking free from identity-based silos. Norbese Flint from Black Women for Wellness explained one key benefit of an intersectionality framework, which is that you don't have to choose one identity over another when engaging in advocacy. She said, with the civil rights movement, women, particularly Black women, were having to put their race in front of their gender. And in the feminist movement, Black women and women of color were supposed to put their gender in front of their race. RJ is really that kind of spot in between where women can be both women and whatever other identity they bring to that. And they don't have to put one in front of the other first. You don't have to choose. Not having to choose one identity over another is important because it means that advocacy spaces are more welcoming of individuals with intersecting marginalized identities. Nia Martin Robinson, who was with the Sierra Club at the time of our interview, described herself as an EJ activist who does her work through an RJ frame. She said, "We're creating the kinds of comprehensive and holistic space that people can bring their whole selves to. So I can show up to a rally and say, I am a Black queer woman living in the South, and understand that all of those things and all of those identities impact me and my ability to participate in this work in a certain way." This quote indicates that an intersectional approach frees advocates from having to artificially compartmentalize different aspects of their identity, which in turn allows them to participate more fully and with greater efficacy in their advocacy work. So what is the implication for toxics and reproductive health specifically? This approach helps advocates to bring critical environmental reproductive health issues to the forefront that relate to identity-based intersections and risk. For example, advocates are raising awareness regarding adverse reproductive health outcomes associated with toxic hair relaxers used by many Black women under pressure to conform to European beauty standards. This reflects intersections of race and gender. They're also bringing attention to the toxic effects of scented feminine hygiene products used disproportionately by Black and Latina women due to both cultural norms and corporate advertising campaigns targeting them. This reflects intersections of race, ethnicity, and gender. And they're bringing attention to occupational exposures to toxic beauty products among nail salon workers and pesticide exposures among farm workers. This reflects intersections of race, gender, socioeconomic status, and immigrant status. The second way in which advocates are using an intersectional framework is to break free from issue-based silos. When advocates talk about doing intersectional work, they're also talking about combining issues together into one frame, which was viewed as a more holistic approach that better addresses the complexities of people's lives. As one participant noted, the issues that you face in your day-to-day intersect with one another. And so, by addressing multiple issues that affect communities at one time, as opposed to forcing people to choose to center their advocacy around one thing, is more responsive to the way that we view the world and the way that we experience the world around us. So what does this mean for toxics and reproductive health? Miriam Young, who was with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum when I interviewed her, said, "We have always thought that our nail salon advocacy work was really close to the heart of our mission and close to the way we do our work, which is intersectional and multi-issue, because it's such a rich topic that allows us to talk about environmental justice and economic justice and immigrant rights and immigrant access and reproductive health rights and justice and workers' rights." As you can see, in addition to being an important issue in and of itself, talking about toxics can facilitate discussing other social issues of concern to an organization's constituency. And finally, the third way in which advocates are using an intersectional framework is to break free from movement-based silos. Here I have a diagram showing how developing a multi-issue agenda that incorporates toxics can facilitate cross-movement collaboration. Advocating around toxics can help to bring social movements together because it's linked to issues that are encompassed within so many different social movements. In the course of my research, it became clear that the intersection of EJ and RJ was very dense and complex because numerous social movements have a vested interest in this issue. In addition to the EJ and RJ movements, this intersection included the mainstream environmental movement, the environmental health movement, the reproductive rights movement, as well as workers' rights, immigrant rights, women's health, racial justice, economic justice, the toxics movement, and others. Participants cited many perceived benefits of working across movements, including expanding bases of support, gaining new perspectives, sharing resources, information, and expertise, and working towards progressive change. It is this last benefit that perhaps commands the most attention. Amy Weintraub, who was with West Virginia Free at the time of our interview, said, quote, we must, quote, she said that the left-wing, quote, must work together if we are going to have a movement that is sustainable and that can really operate effectively in the face of a very well-organized, well-funded conservative movement. We can no longer exist in silos of LGBT movement, reproductive healthcare movement, environmental justice, racial justice, end quote. According to results from my demographic survey, the participant pool was left-wing, and thus the desire to oppose right-wing politics was likely representative of most or all of the sample. By joining together across movements, advocates perceive that they can extend their influence beyond the intersection of toxics and reproductive health to challenge social, political, and economic power imbalances that contribute to numerous inequities. In this way, the issue of toxics can serve as a catalyst for widespread progressive change. In terms of implications of this research, whereas most collective action frames are context specific, this research suggests that an intersectionality frame is a master frame, which is flexible and inclusive enough to be used by many different social movements for many kinds of issues. Therefore, not only can this frame activate a broad base around toxic exposures and reproductive health inequities, but its mobilizing potential can also be used by advocates operating outside of the EJ-RJ intersection. And now I'll outline a few recommendations that are based not only on the data included in the manuscript that I just presented on, but also other data from this study. Study participants saw significant value in social movements coming together, but many also noted that the confluence of so many movements can create a high level of interpersonal complexity and competing priorities that can influence framing, agendas, allyship, and ultimately the ability to reach shared goals. They mentioned challenges such as disputes over which policy solutions are best, which frames they think will resonate most with potential supporters, and tensions that can arise when advocates and organizations with different levels of privilege collaborate. In order to build well-functioning cross-movement collaborations that can flourish, there is a need to invest in intergroup processes. Participants said that it's challenging to secure funding for intersectional work because the philanthropic world is relatively siloed in how it vets funding applications, and they may be sent to the wrong program officer for review. Also, intersectional frames may come across as overambitious, making it critical for applicants to state interim deliverables while being clear about how these short-term deliverables fit within their long-term strategy. Funders might consider examining how they vet intersectional funding applications and develop guidelines for applicants on submitting more successful applications. An intersectional framework bears similarities to a health in all policies approach, which seeks to break down governmental silos by creating diverse intersectoral collaborations to address inextricably linked problems. This approach involves thinking about implications for health, health equity, and sustainability when making decisions across policy areas. Community-based organizations who use an intersectionality framework can be valuable partners in developing and implementing a health in all policies approach. And finally, this study used qualitative methods, which are not often combined with quantitative research, examining environmental exposures in health, and can be useful for understanding complex exposure pathways, such as intersectional ones. Adding qualitative components to studies could, for example, improve our understanding of people's lived experiences and the ways in which structural systems of privilege and oppression impact risk of toxic exposures at the individual level. And finally, I'd like to thank all of my study participants for generously sharing their time and insights with me. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Dr. Barbara Israel and Dr. Amy Schultz, as well as other contributors to this work. And thank you to the University of Michigan for providing funding for this research.
Great, we're going to move into our panel discussion. So I'm going to have all of our speakers go ahead and put yourselves on video, and I'll pass it off to Karen.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for all the presentations. So first off, I'd like to ask Dr. Zota, you spoke about centering marginalized groups, and Dr. Mandel, you spoke a lot with health advocates. What and how should environmental health researchers learn from advocates and health impacted individuals about what exposures and what systems of oppression have the most impact on their health? And do you see this type of collaboration as what kind of role is it going to play in the future of environmental health research?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think one of the key messages, right, is that this work is really multidisciplinary in nature and really transdisciplinary, right? So it's trying to create something new from, by taking the components of these different parts. And, even beyond just thinking about disciplines, I think it really requires different perspectives, right? And so I think the perspective of the on the ground reality is so key to advancing intersectionality and systems change. So that can take many different forms. It could be through qualitative research, which Dr. Mandel spoke about. We're doing some of that. It could be through community engaged research or community-based participatory research. So what I didn't talk about with the environmental injustice and beauty work. So we have this theory, and now we're kind of collecting empirical data to test those ideas very much with EJ/RJ groups like We Act in Harlem, and then Black Women for Wellness in South LA. So I think there's a couple of different, ways that what that can look like. But I think these kind of more and more, we need to collaborate with people who are not like us. We need these kind of collaborations that make us feel that are a bit uncomfortable, like outside of our comfort zone, to like push the work where it needs to go.
Yeah, I think also this type of collaboration would really be very beneficial. Advocates are incredibly knowledgeable about exposures and structural factors that impact them. I know that I personally learned quite a lot from them during the interviews. And among the advocates I spoke with, not only do they work professionally in this area, but many of them are from the communities who they advocate for. And so they have, very firsthand knowledge of the issues facing these communities. I think these collaborations are particularly important if we want to study marginalized populations who in many cases may not trust researchers, but who may trust advocates and their organizations. And I agree with Dr. Zota. I think participatory action research would be an excellent way to partner with advocates, also asking them to sit on research advisory panels. And I definitely think it's valuable to speak with individuals whose health has been impacted as a source of data. And I think, we can learn these things in many ways, such as through interviews, focus groups, surveys, and photo voice, which is a participatory action research method where people can take photographs of scenes from their lives and reflect on them. And then these photographs can be shared with policymakers to create a dialogue and influence broader change.
Great, thank you so much. In the studies presented, and especially yours, Dr. Alvarez, you talked about the different levels, be it individual, neighborhoods, communities. Could you comment about what are the advantages and disadvantages of analysis at the different levels? And this actually tied into an audience question about, let's see where it was. Somebody asked, could you talk about what was found in your analytical approach that would not have been found in a traditional approach?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In the, so theoretically or conceptually, like, especially under the critical environmental justice framework, which is founded by like David Pello at UC Santa Barbara, he talks about look at the importance of looking at like a multi-scalar perspective. So we're connecting all of the various levels from like the individual to the neighborhood to the global, because in order to understand environmental toxins and all of these environmental inequalities, I mean, they do pass through these various levels, right? But for this study, we did look at the neighborhood. it was interesting when I spoke with my collaborator, because she looked at the individual level, and she's mostly in sociology of health and in health and illness. And like for me, coming from it from an environmental sociological standpoint, we usually talk about the neighborhood more so than the individual, because that's where like industrial plants are placed, or that's where like a park is placed. So it made sense for this project to be thinking about the neighborhood level, and it had like benefits in that. But I do think I do think it's important to look at the other levels. And I don't know, I mean, statistically, I mean, to map out like that multi-level, multi-scalar analysis, I mean, I'm still trying to process that. Like I've been thinking about doing like a cross classified model to look at like these intersectional groups, and also look at like geographic variation, which was like a question that was in the chat. But I'm still trying to map that out, because it can be rough to translate that. But it is important to look at all the various levels, but also be thinking about the interconnection. So definitely when like Dr. Zota was talking about like the exposome, like I was totally thinking about like, oh yeah, the ripple effects. Like, I mean, that's part of intersectionality too, is to look at those multiplying effects that are happening at these levels of intersection, not just spatially, but also across groups.
Great, thank you so much. So there are, many environmental health scientists who may be on this webinar today. What are a couple of simple things they can do to apply an intersectional frame when designing their next study? And can researchers revisit data or projects they've done with an intersectional lens? Maybe Dr. Zota, you can comment on that. And then Dr. Mendel, could you also comment on ways that qualitative data could be used to strengthen these studies?
Sure. When I give the hour-long version of this talk, I usually end with key recs for recommendations. So I can pull from that, and I know that a lot of people are very interested in the quantitative methods used, and I really commend Dr. Alvarez for kind of forging ahead and developing these new methods. Our commentary does kind of try to summarize some of the available quantitative methods in this space, but with the note that this is really a cutting edge space, and there's a lot of method development going on in kind of how you do quantitative intersectionality work, because it has for so long been grounded in qualitative work. But some key things, yes, you can do secondary data analysis to try to look for excess risk at different intersectional identities. And there are some simple descriptive things you can do. Obviously, you could always do two-way interactions. On the conceptual side, I think really this even, moving beyond thinking about race as a biological variable is just such a critical thing that, our field is complicit in. And this is about kind of from every way of how we write our discussion sections to how we dig deeper into when we do just document a disparity on what's driving it, to start including measures of intersectional discrimination into our studies. So I mentioned one validated survey scale. There are some other ones. So there are quantitative survey scales. And to, I really think thinking from an exposure kind of exposure science perspective, to move beyond thinking about kind of these more proximate risk factors, to thinking, how can we start thinking about like systems of oppression and how they may affect pollutant emissions or blood lead levels, or all of these exposures that we study are very much patterned by intersecting systems of privilege and oppression. So how can we start kind of conceptualizing the studies to really kind of to get at that? And so those are some suggestions, but with the notion that, I think a lot of the ideas we presented today they're going to take a lot of method development, because we can't just take what we've been doing and kind of operationalize this. So that's kind of the big picture. It's going to take a lot of innovation, but there are some low-hanging fruit things that people can do.
I think, combining qualitative and quantitative methods can give us a richer understanding of complex exposure pathways than either approach can achieve on its own by integrating in-depth qualitative data with in-depth qualitative perspectives with broader generalizable quantitative results. And I also think qualitative research can help to generate new lines of inquiry that we can then explore quantitatively. And I think with intersectionality, we're trying to understand people's lived experiences and also understand the broader context that influences these experiences. And I think qualitative research is adept at exploring both of these things. So we can use it, for example, to understand more about people's exposures and their beliefs, activities, or behaviors that could influence these exposures. It could also give us more detail on the kinds of health problems that people might experience as a result of their exposures. And then in terms of the broader context, qualitative data can help us to understand more about people's physical environments and then about how the social, cultural, and economic context shapes risk. And there are various types of mixed methods approaches that researchers might consider. So it's just having an exploratory study phase where they might use qualitative research to help develop their study instruments, or an explanatory phase where they use qualitative data to help understand and interpret their quantitative findings, or they can have a convergent design where they can compare qualitative and quantitative data. And I also think that qualitative data can be really useful for planning or evaluating interventions.
Great, thank you. Che also has many health professionals in our audience. Given the results of your studies and frameworks that you used, what are some ways that they can apply an intersectional lens to patient care?
So I want to highlight one kind of clinical framework that has emerged that is very much grounded in intersectionality. And we talk about this in the qualitative paper around Black women's psychosocial experiences with fibroid care and treatment. And it's called structural competency. And it's really, and there's a few papers, there's a group out of Vanderbilt that is really kind of, it's been writing a lot about this. And it's really this whole idea, and it's kind of taking the idea of cultural competency to another level. And it's really this idea that like patient care and patient doctor interactions are influenced by much more, like many contextual factors outside of this one-on-one interaction, or beyond the individual patient. And so there's a lot of theoretical work, and now there's like groups, I think even at Berkeley, there's a group that's then trying to like really say, okay, well, let's take this theory and what does it actually mean? Like they've developed case studies for what it actually means for like patient doctor interactions. And I think they're even trying to like move it into medical education, but it's called structural competency. And while somebody else talks, I can even try to pull up the name of the person who I'm going to try to pull up the name of the people at Vanderbilt, the group that's kind of working on this stuff. If anybody else wants to add while I try to figure this out, but I don't know. Okay, maybe not. Well,
it's okay. We can. Dr. Alvarez, did you have something to say? No, let's move to a couple of audience questions since we're, and then Dr. Zota, you can mention it when you find it. We had one, Dr. Alvarez, is there a concern about group variability? By this, I mean, does this approach, your innovative approach, run the risk of parsing the groups too finely?
That's a good question. So we did look at sample size across the different intersectional stratums, and we did find that 75% had 30 or more, which which is promising following the guidelines of or rule of thumbs of statistics. But that is a thing to think about when we're doing this type of stuff, because you do have to think about what levels or what categories are there or not, right? I mean, I didn't look at immigration status. That's like something I'm interested in, and there's a bunch of, an audience member mentioned like pregnancy too. Like and I think that also leads into some of the other stuff you all mentioned in the previous questions. Like, that's why it's important to be on the ground, like understanding, because intersectionality, really one of the major things that it brings up is the invisibility of these intersectional groups. So that's why it's really important to be doing like these on the ground research or also qualitative research.
Okay, we had another question for you, Dr. Alvarez. Your research seems like it could have an application to an EJ mapping tool. Do you have any ideas of how this intersectionality approach and scaling of census tracts could be applied to an EJ mapping tool?
I think the way I've been doing some follow-up studies using the Cal Enviro screen, which is an EJ mapping tool in California, which is pretty innovative. And I've been using that with this model. I think it's also this model, I also I do want to expand it to not just be like used in academia, but also used among community groups if they like it. So that is something that I'm working towards. I think it's something that could be used to understand sort of these inequalities themselves and how are they intersectionally patterned.
And Karen, did you get the citation?
Yes, can you read it out loud actually?
Sure, it's so I think the name is Jonathan Metzl, METZL, and I think the key paper, the first paper on it is Structural Competency, Theorizing a New Medical Engagement with Stigma and Inequality. And that was actually published in Social Science and Medicine a couple years ago. And I think that group has then published other papers, but that, if folks want to look that up, I think that's exactly how you push intersectionality into the clinical space.
Great, awesome. Let's see, there was a question for you, Dr. Zota. Is there a documented link between fibroids and maternal morbidity or mortality?
Yeah, I saw that. I think it's a great question. And so with maternal mortality per se, I'm not sure if that exact analysis has been done, but fibroids is a well-known kind of complication in pregnancy. And so it is associated with greater risk of cesarean, preterm birth, as well as kind of compromised fertility. So given that some of these pregnancy complications then are risk factors for maternal morbidity and mortality, one can imagine that it's on the causal pathway. And once again, in the qualitative workspace, and particularly for Black women, fibroids can be a big problem that complicates pregnancy. And so I think it's kind of warrants examination, especially from this kind of social ecological model. And I think generally this kind of social ecological intersectionality model really, you could really imagine why it should be integrated into kind of looking and thinking about maternal mortality and racial disparities in maternal mortality specifically.
Okay, great. We have a couple of other questions. One that was about how can this intersectional approach, has there been dialogue with the researchers who are working on cumulative impacts and cumulative risk? Because that's something that we have also seen talked about a lot. This person asked, as a social scientist now working on cumulative impacts, it seems like these two sort of frameworks or fields are necessary to get at a true lived experience.
So surprisingly, I'm a big fan of the cumulative impacts, cumulative risk work. I think it's done a lot for moving EJ forward, but surprisingly, at least in the academic literature, there hasn't been. So even when I was writing this piece, I mean, there's really very little about intersectionality in any kind of environmental health scientific literature. I think there's a potential there, but to date, to my knowledge, not really.
Okay, great. Well, sounds like there needs to be more work done there. We had one, of course, we're going to touch on COVID. Given the disproportionate burden of COVID on minority communities, how could intersectionality inform researchers' work looking at underlying causes of these health disparities?
Definitely there, I mean, I'm not too familiar with the cumulative risks and the cumulative impacts research, but it's definitely, I imagine that's what it's about, right? Because COVID is like an environmental justice issue. I mean, people are staying more in their houses. There's a lot of toxins in the house. There's a lot of intersections with who is essential and who's been essential workers. So there has been a lot of discussion with that, and it is definitely part of a lens to examine the pandemic across environmental justice and with intersectionality theory.
I mean, I think that there's been a attention to, at least in some circles, on how structural racism is really driving a lot of the racial ethnic disparities in COVID infections and mortality. If you think about that, COVID is in some ways and is really occupational. A lot of the infections are occupationally transmitted, and you think about who's working in these high risk occupations, right? And I mean, I think there's a big need for intersectional analysis of that. I mean, we know that women of color, lower income women of color, are the ones whose employment has disproportionately been impacted in COVID. And so I would just say that even when people bring up kind of which groups are disproportionately impacted, they're rarely thinking about the structural systems or even naming them, right? As to why, for example, lower income women are the ones, women of color, they're the ones losing their jobs, there's I don't know. I think that's all I don't know.
And I'll just add to that also, I think people in multi-generational households are at greater risk. And so, with that, immigrant families come to mind. So there's, I think an intersection there.
Yeah. Well, going from COVID to another hot topic now, someone asked, do you see the intersectionality framework playing an important role in climate research? And, how do you see this framework in informing what climate research and advocates should be talking about in regards to how we solve our climate crisis?
I definitely
go for it.
I do think, I know that there's a lot of work being done at the EJ-RJ intersection about climate research. And actually I chose to focus on toxics, but I could have gone in that direction as well. There's dialogue, for example, using women as a building block for intersectional analyses when looking at women within vulnerable communities. And then thinking more broadly, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, and thinking where are women most vulnerable. And that's just, one example.
Okay, great. Let's have one last question. Someone asked, are there any tips for getting into this field? Which is great to hear. I'm extremely passionate about environmental health and environmental justice. And it seems that a lot of opportunities are in academia. Do you expect there to be opportunities outside of academia, such as within companies, corporations, and government in the near future?
So, I mean, I guess I wonder what is meant by this field. I mean, but I will say it seems like the idea of intersectionality in environmental health and justice and climate justice really seems to be growing in the kind of popular consciousness. And I think, you know, just like for Gen Z, their version of climate justice or environmental justice is intersectional. And I think that's just the more intuitive way of thinking. And I mean, I separately also know that NIH is getting more interested also in this idea of intersectionality in public health and biomedical research. So I guess the opportunities will arise if people make them.
Any other last thoughts? Okay, well, thank you so much for your discussion, answering questions, and for your presentations today. Hannah, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. We're approaching at the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on CHE's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. The next CHE EDC Strategies Partnership webinar will take place this coming Tuesday, February 23rd, and is titled Countdown: How Our Modern World is Threatening Sperm Counts, Altering Male and Female Reproductive Development, and Imperiling the Future of the Human Race. Then on Wednesday, February 24th, the CHE Alaska Partnership will be hosting the webinar Promoting Equity in Health, an Anti-Colonial Model from an Indigenous-led Marine Science Laboratory. Finally, to close the month, on Thursday, February 25th, CHE will be hosting our 5th webinar in our Generation Chemicals series on prenatal exposures to phthalates, oil and gas, and pesticides, effects on birth outcomes and developmental disabilities. To learn more and to RSVP, please visit our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Ami Zota, Camila Alvarez, and Rebecca Mendel for taking time to present today, and to you, Karen, for your excellent moderation. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay well and healthy, and have a good day.